Good afternoon. You guys are attending the Abbreviated Request for Reimbursement, or RFR, and Quarterly Reporting Training. My name is Jean Booth. I am a GPA with DCFS Victim Service Grant Management Unit. Most of you are pretty familiar with me. With me today, I have Christine Holbert monitoring the chat and Jenny Escalera taking notes on any questions asked. We have a lot to go over today, and your time is important to us, just as it is important that we offer instruction and communication between our agency and yours. Some of this information may be a bit easy for those who have had our awards for years, but we ask that you still actively listen and not multitask during this training, as we hope everyone will be able to learn a few new things. Today, we're going to briefly get to know the victim service team, briefly discuss what grants the victim service specialists manage, discuss risk assessments, and go into detail on how to fill out the RFR workbook and what documentation we need. We ask that you type your questions into the chat box. We will address all questions throughout this presentation. Thanks. So we're proud to announce that we have a new victim service manager. Her name is Andrea Valenzuela. She started on Monday, so she's kind of new to our unit. We're very excited to have her on board. You'll notice that there's quite a few open positions at this time. And then there's myself, the Grants and Projects Analyst, or GPA, Christine, who's been here about 4 months. She's my partner in crime, the Grants and Projects Analyst. And then we've got Nita Daisy, who is our Management Analyst and processes all the RFRs. Our CAP position is going to be open as of Friday, and Jenny Escalera is our band coordinator and crime victim liaison, who's assisting with CAP, along with Dina Fippen, who's our crime victim liaison, and she's been here about a month. So thank you and welcome to all of our staff. Some of the grants that we manage are the VOCA Victims of Crime Act Assistance, the Victims of Domestic Violence Marriage License, Family Violence Preventions and Services Act, and FIPSA also has 3 American Recovery or ARPA plans, the Domestic Violence, Sexual Victimization, and COVID testing. We also manage the Victims of Crime Act Compensation Program and the Confidential Address Program, or CAP. And if you could take a moment to open the chat box and answer these questions, that would be helpful. Now that you've gotten to know us, let's get to know you a little bit. What part of the state do you work in? How long have you worked in victim services? And are you the primary person responsible for completing the RFRs or quarterly reports in your agency? Your GERS, or Grant Instructions and Requirements, are updated each state fiscal year and are sent with your executed NOSA. They must be read and the last page signed and returned to our agency. The signature page is due now for VOCA and marriage license if you haven't already submitted it. We're now going to briefly talk about risk assessments and how they affect your RFR submission. Unfortunately, we are unable to change the name of this tool, as it is a requirement of us to have risk assessments on our agencies from the feds. The risk level considers numerous factors. It has absolutely nothing to do with our perception of the ability of your organization to perform its goals. It is not something shared with other agencies or with the public, but an internal designation for DCFS Victim Services staff. It is not meant to be punitive, rather it's an indication of how much technical assistance to provide, the frequency of fiscal and programmatic reviews, and when the agency will be monitored next. Risk levels may be adjusted throughout the year at the discretion of the GMU, depending on the agency's documentation and situation. Agencies may not request risk level changes. You will be notified of your risk level when you receive your executed Notice of Subaward, or your NOSA. Regardless of risk, all agencies must maintain all backup documentation within the agency. Paper or electronic documentation is acceptable. Let's briefly review the risk levels. Low risk, you have to submit your RFR workbook, sign the Complete the RFR page, and provide all personnel backup documentation along with your general ledger. You're going to maintain all backup documentation, and a GPA will request your RFR backup documents at least once during the state fiscal year. With moderate, it's the same as low, except we're going to request backup documentation for the complete RFR at least twice during the state fiscal year. High risk, you're going to receive an on-site monitoring in state fiscal year 23. You may be required to have regular technical assistance meetings. Submit your workbook, signed complete RFR page, and all the relative backup documentation in the order it is on your workbook, and you're going to maintain all backup documentation. Are there any questions regarding risk level or anything we've talked about so far today? All right. So we're going to locate that chat box one more time. Which agency risk levels are required to maintain 100% documentation of grant expenditures in-house? A high, B moderate, C low, D all, E none. Excellent. You're correct. It's D, all risk levels. Even though only high risk level agencies are required to submit 100% documentation with RFRs, all agencies must maintain 100% documentation in their records. True or false, and you can answer T or F. If an agency is low risk, they will always remain low risk for the rest of the fiscal year. That is correct. False. The GMU staff can reassess agency risk at any time during the fiscal year. Are there any questions?
Nothing in the chat, Jean.
Perfect. We'll zip on by. What is an RFR? Your RFR stands for your request for reimbursement. RFRs are submitted monthly by agencies to get reimbursements for the grant allowable expenditures that the agency has made. RFRs consist of a signed RFR cover sheet and backup documentation. Agencies are also required to submit their RFR Excel workbook with each request. I think I passed something. Oh, all RFR requests are paid on a reimbursement basis. Proof of payment must exist prior to reimbursement from DCFS Grants Management Unit or GMU. All items reimbursed must be during the award period. They are due no later than the 15th of the month following expenditure. Please remember to check that an item is on your budget prior to submitting for it to be reimbursed. If it is not on your budget and you'd like to get reimbursement for it, please contact a GMU staff, either myself or Christine, and ask if it's an allowable expense to be placed upon your budget. We're happy to answer those questions. We're going to go through a quick overview of the RFR workbook. As a reminder, all RFR requests are paid on a reimbursement basis. Proof of payment must exist prior to the reimbursement from DCFS Grants Management Victim Service Unit. Please review the instruction tab prior to working on your first RFR. Many of your questions can be answered by reading this page. If you still have questions after reading this page and consulting the grant instructions and requirements, or the GERS, please contact one of the GPAs. We're here to help you succeed. Now let's talk about the RFR tabs. It's really small on this screen, so if you want to follow along with the example RFR workbook, that would be great. You can try clicking on most things on this workbook, and you can see that it will not let you because most of it is locked to prevent editing. You can change the values on this sheet by entering information on the Summary tab for the month. The top of the sheet will tell you the award number that this RFR workbook is for, and this one is 16575-20-XXX. Below that, you will see your agency name. This one is the Victim Service Agency Incorporated. Below this is your agency address. Make sure this is correct, as if a paper check is ever mailed to you, we want it sent to the correct place. We must use the address that is within the Secretary of State and Controller's Office. If you need this changed, we can help you with this process. Next, you will see the agency EIN and vendor number. Please check that these are correct. You will also see that this page has information on your approved budget, total prior requests, current request, year-to-date total, and your budget balance. This should help you check how much of your award has been expended and help keep you on track throughout the fiscal year. The summary rows are locked. If you need changes to summary information, please email your GPA. The summary rows will populate as numbers are entered in the categories below. If for whatever reason you may end up with an unlocked workbook, do not change any of the formulas in the workbook. If they get changed, it messes up the whole integrity of the workbook, and we have to issue you a new one. Now we're going to move to each section of the Summary tab with an overview of the required backup documentation, and then how to use the backup documentation to fill out the RFR workbook. All personnel, including fringe documentation, is the same, regardless of risk level. Agencies must submit pay stubs and activity-based timesheets or attestations along with invoice and proof of payment for fringe documentation. Personnel backup documentation includes pay stubs, your activity-based timesheet, or 100% attestation if the position is completely paid by that same grant. All fringe backup, which includes invoices showing employee breakdown, employer paid only will be reimbursed, and your proof of payment. When you submit this, think, would somebody who knows nothing about our agency be able to understand this documentation? Make notes if needed to make things easier for us to understand. The workbooks are set up to allow 3 pay periods per employee per month. If you have additional pay periods or personnel changes, email a victim service GPA the requested changes prior to RFR submission. This email should have the name and job title of the employee and the effective change date, and we will make those changes and return to your updated workbook as quickly as possible. The job title, employee name, grant percent, and total formulas at the end of this section are locked. You're going to enter the total hours paid in the total hours worked and the total grant hours from the employee's activity-based time card. The grant percent would all automatically populate. Then you're going to enter the gross wage and the check direct deposit number in the appropriate cells. The grant percentage is the cost allocation for all of personnel, including fringe. Documentation for this section of personnel includes the activity-based timesheet and pay stubs. All backup documentation must be submitted in the order it is shown on the section. All costs in Section 2 of personnel are employer paid. All employee paid fringe is covered in the gross wages from the previous section. Enter your total amount of fringe coverage in the appropriate category. If challenges to the workbook arise, contact your GPA. The personnel totals section is locked. Do not edit any formulas on this spreadsheet. The total column is derived from the employee's total amount of fringe and gross wage. Grant allocation is derived from the activity-based time cards. This is your cost allocation. The total reimbursement request column is the total amount of the total and the cost allocation. This is the total you are eligible for reimbursement for each employee. Do we have any questions about anything that we've talked about, including payroll? This is where we get our biggest problems when processing the RFR. So I want to make sure that you guys have all of your questions answered for this section. Okay, well, if you guys have questions, please make sure to ask them in the chat box and we will answer them. Let's move on over to travel or training. Just as a reminder, we can only reimburse after the trip or training has been completed. All travel or training must be pre-approved and on your budget narrative. If it's not, you need to reach out to your GPA and request to have that training approved. There are various trainings that are not allowable under specific awards, so we need to make sure that the trainings that you go to are allowable under your funding source. I would really hate to have you guys go spend a bunch of money on a training just to find out that it's not an eligible training for your funding source. So please make sure to reach out to us via email, and we're happy to review that and respond to you as quickly as possible. The training must be related to the purpose of the grant. We can only reimburse after the trip or training has been completed. Please be sure to read your GERS 2315 on allowability of specific costs and GERS 2317 on travel. Meals. Please show on all meal and food purchase if it was for an employee who is traveling or for a victim. Meals for employees should be in the travel or training section. Meals for victims should only be in the other section. Meals for employees are only reimbursable when the employee is in travel status and when the final destination is more than 50 miles one way from the employee's workstation. Document this and the purpose of the travel. Meals or refreshments served during meetings to employees, boards of directors, professional associations, or members of the public are not allowed. Reimbursement for incidentals will occur only when the travel consists of a flight and/or overnight stay. Meals will be reimbursed at the GSA rate for the employee's destination. A printout of the GSA rate for the area visited must be attached to the RFR. Actual cost versus GSA rate depends on the agency's written travel policies. If reimbursing actual cost, an agency must include meal receipts. They cannot submit both reimbursement methods. Only one method will be accepted, and they must apply to all travel reimbursements for the agencies. We cannot reimburse tips on meals. If you're going to use the actual cost, please keep in mind that we cannot reimburse over the GSA rate. So it's going to be actual cost or GSA rate, whichever is a lower rate. And we will talk about the GSA rate in a couple of slides. When can employee meals be reimbursed? Travel to a destination that is at least 50 miles one way from the workstation, and you're going to leave at or before 7 a.m. for breakfast, leave at or before 11 a.m. and return to work site after 1:30 p.m. for lunch, and you're going to leave at or before 5:30 p.m. and return to work after 7 p.m. for dinners. Meals provided as part of the meeting or conference agenda are not eligible for reimbursement. I have a question that says, where do I find the GER? The GERs are sent to you with your executed NOSA. If you have an executed NOSA but you can't find your GERs, just send us an email and I'm happy to send you your GERs again. The U.S. General Service Administration, or the GSA rate, can be found at this website. The GSA rates are updated usually with every fiscal year, and it's the federal fiscal year, so that's October 1st. You're going to want to keep an eye on this, though, because I do know that the federal agencies update this based on things going on in society, too. So the GSA rate for the mileage was increased in July of this year because of how expensive gas has gotten. So just kind of keep an eye on the GSA rate when you're doing a lot of traveling and make sure to include the per diem or GSA rate in your travel reimbursement so that we know that you did actually look at it and are using that GSA rate. Okay, required travel documentation, your printout of the GSA rate for your location, any receipts for parking, receipts for airfare, receipts for car rental or other ground transportation, and please remember that grants do not reimburse on tips or donations, hotel front desk itemized receipts, proof of payment, mileage log, and proof of payment to an employee for mileage. And just as a reminder, travel to or from employee's residence and workstation is not allowed. But if an employee is taking a victim to a therapy appointment, that travel mileage can be included as travel for that employee. And then any conference agenda if you're going to a conference. All travel or training must be pre-approved and on your budget narrative or pre-approved by the grants management team in an email. All expenses related to a single trip must be submitted on the same RFR month in order to avoid duplication of payment on different elements of the same trip. Do we have any questions on travel? Okay, let's move on to operating. Backup documentation for each section must include your invoice, cost allocation, and proof of payment. If payment is made with a credit card, the credit card statement listing the purchase must be submitted as well as proof of payment to the credit card company for the statement amount. To fill out the workbook, you're going to enter a brief description of the expense. For example, rent. Then you're going to enter the payee or vendor. Then you're going to enter the total amount of the expense from the invoice. Then you're going to enter the check number you paid and the date that it was paid. Finally, you're going to enter the percent allocated to each funding stream. We have highlighted sections for the funding stream in question that you're submitting your RFR on, and 3 additional funding streams. If not already listed, type in the funding stream that isn't related to the RFR. If you have more than 4 funding sources allocated to this expense, put the allocated amount for the grant in the highlighted section and provide allocation on each invoice. All allocations must equal 100%. Backup documentation for each section must include invoice, cost allocation, and proof of payment. Equipment. This must be pre-approved and on your budget narrative. This includes electronics of all types. That means computers and cell phones must be in equipment. Computers should be labeled with property of grant name and number. In GERS 2322, it will have a list of how to keep a log of your equipment and what needs to go on that equipment log. That list is also provided on your screen. Any equipment purchases must be pre-approved by your GPA. This includes electronics of all types. For detailed information, reference GERS 2322 or reach out to your GPA. Are there any questions so far?
I'm not seeing anything in the chat, Jean.
All right, let's continue on to contracts. Prior to your initial reimbursement, this cost must be on your budget narrative and approved by the GMU. The contract, applicable licenses, and confidentiality forms must be submitted to the GPA prior to your first RFR submission. Please keep in mind, if we do not have the contracts, license, and confidentiality forms, we will not reimburse for that contractor. Documentation needed for this section is an invoice from the contractor, cost allocation, and proof of payment. A change for this year, as I just stated, your contracted payment will not be reimbursed until the GMU verifies that a current copy of your contract has been received by our agency. We're going to briefly talk about match. Most of you have match waivers with VOCA, but if you do have FIPSA funding or did not submit a match waiver, you're going to have match requirements. And match requires documentation based on the category. So personnel is the same type of documentation as personnel and match, etc. Documentation is the same for each category as if you were requesting reimbursement. Volunteers as match, you need volunteer sign-in sheets and a volunteer evaluation. If you have questions on what this evaluation looks like, please reach out to one of your GPAs. Match should be identified on your general ledger. And for more information on match, see GER 2311 cost sharing or match requirements. Match is required for VOCA unless you have a match waiver, and FIPSA awards. Unfortunately, FIPSA does not allow match waivers. Match can be volunteers, in-kind support, or any services not paid for by federal funding. For further information regarding match, please contact either myself or Christine or review GER 2311. If you have indirect on your award, the RFR workbook will automatically calculate it based on the other category and your budget information that you've submitted. For most people, if you have indirect on your award, it's a de minimis 10%, and it will automatically calculate that 10%. If you had another type of indirect, we would have that calculation already included. If for whatever reason that indirect is not calculating correctly, just please reach out to us and we're happy to update those formulas.
Jean, there are a couple of questions in the chat going back to the volunteer stuff.
Okay. It says, may volunteer sign-in sheet be replaced with volunteer timesheet? Yeah, that would be fine. As long as there's some way to track the volunteer's time, that's what we're looking at when we're talking about a sign-in sheet. The sign-in sheet can either be just a sign-in that states the time and day that they're working, or you can have a timesheet, and either one is acceptable. The next question is, where would I find volunteer hourly pay for federal fiscal year 22 to 23? There is a website that I cannot remember what it's called. I can get you that information, and I'll include that in our fax when I send that out. I cannot think of the name of that website off the top of my head. But there's a website that you can go to, or you can look up the job and your location and off of like ZipRecruiter or something like that. And it will give you like the base, like a range of pay for that particular job. And you can use that as a volunteer evaluation. Any other questions? Yeah, thank you, Maxine. It's independentsector.org. Okay, so let's continue on. And we're going to talk about submitting your RFR. When you submit your RFR, you're going to make sure that all items are on your approved budget and that you have an email with the GPA approval for items not on your approved budget. You're going to double check what you entered in the workbook matches your documentation. You're going to write notes on any documentation that you think might need further explanation. You're going to print and sign the RFR tab for the month you are submitting. You can sign these electronically if your agency allows that. You're going to put the documentation you're required to submit, see your risk level, in the order that they are listed in your workbook summary and scan them. You're going to email the RFR workbook, signed RFR sheet, and backup documentation to fundsrequest@dcfs.nv.gov. One thing I do want to point out with submitting your RFRs, and this is going to be a kind of stickler for this year, if you have personnel changes, you need to submit your workbook and the personnel changes prior to your RFR submission. If you make a comment or a note or put a sticky in your RFR workbook with the backup, we're not going to approve that. you have to pre-approve any personnel changes prior to your RFR submission via email. We typically get back to you within the hour of submission. Very rarely does it take more than a day. So please make sure that you do any personnel changes prior to your RFR submission so you don't avoid missing reimbursement for an employee. We're going to briefly run through how to submit a revised RFR. If you have additional costs, you want to remove costs or change costs to a previously submitted RFR workbook, you're going to check the revised box on the RFR tab for that month. You're going to sign the RFR cover sheet and email it to Funds Request with an email explaining the changes you've made, an attachment with the signed revised RFR cover sheet, and any additional backup documentation for new items added. You do not need to resubmit all the previous documentation as we already have that. We just need the documentation for the changes. And then you're also going to send your Excel workbook for that award. Here's an example of how you would submit that form. You're going to click that button as it's a revised RFR. Are there any questions over anything we've talked about so far? Okay. We're going to talk briefly about the award period. Services prior to the first day of the award cannot be charged, and some expenses may need to be prorated. For example, most of your awards start July 1st, 2022. Any expenses prior to July 1st, 2022 cannot be expended on this new award, as that award only started July 1st, 2022. So those expenses may need to be prorated. The same thing goes for grants that expire. The grant cannot reimburse for services after the last day of the award period. This may also require proration. RFR processing. Like I said, if an employee or item is not on the budget or on the workbook and/or the budget narrative, it will not be reimbursed. You need to contact the GPA prior to submitting an RFR with an employee or item not on the workbook or budget narrative. Email the GPA prior to submitting your RFR for any workbook changes that may need to be made. All documentation must be maintained by your agency for all RFR requests. Our goal is to process all RFRs within 30 days after receipt of the request. By taking a few extra minutes when preparing your RFRs and following these instructions, that will greatly increase our ability to meet this goal. Some final notes on RFR submission. RFRs are submitted on a reimbursement basis only. RFRs are due no later than the 15th of the month following expenditure. All documentation must be maintained by your agency for all RFR requests. If an employee or item is not on the workbook and/or the budget narrative, it will not be reimbursed. The management analyst may request clarification or additional documentation if needed. If a response from your agency is not received within 5 days, the RFR will be processed minus the items in question, and a revision will need to be requested by your agency if you wish to have that cost reimbursed. Any requests for workbook changes must be emailed with the workbook to the GPA, and if approved, the workbook will be updated and returned to your agency. Our goal is to process all RFRs within 30 days after receipt of the request. Following these instructions will greatly increase our ability to meet this goal. We're going to be stricter about items being on the approved budget this year. Please email the GPA if a cost arises that is not on your budget for approval prior to putting it on your RFR. This may require a subaward amendment. That's why we need you to reach out to your GPA. Are there any questions on the RFR process? I'm going to give you guys a few minutes. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any questions. If you guys have any questions regarding the RFR process, please reach out to myself or Christine. We're happy to help and answer any questions that are specific to your organization. Let's move on to quarterly reporting. You all should receive this reporting guide that was included in the calendar invite for this training. If you don't have the quarterly reporting guide, I suggest that you reach out to either myself or Christine to get it. It's very helpful and will answer quite a few questions that have come up or may come up regarding quarterly reporting. Out the quarterly report. These are the steps that you will need to complete each quarter to submit your VOCA quarterly report. We'll go into more details on each of these steps. Step 1, verify that you have the correct form. The report should have 4 tabs: instructions, demographics, direct services, and your scope of work. You're going to go to the demographic tab and look at the top. You should see your agency name, the grant number for your VOCA award, and the grant name should be VOCA Victim Services. The grant period should be July 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2023. This year's report is a little different from last year's. If you've not received your quarterly reporting template for this year yet, you will receive it when you get your fully executed NOSA. If you have received your NOSA but are unsure if you have your quarterly reporting template, please contact myself or Christine. Our emails are in the end of this PowerPoint. We'll be happy to send your quarterly report form again if your NOSA is executed. This is what the form will look like. You can see that the demographics tab is selected at the bottom, and at the top you can see the award information. Do not change or delete any of the formulas or questions in this workbook. Please read the instructions tab in full. There is a lot of helpful information here that will answer many questions, and if followed correctly, will prevent us from requesting an amended report. On the Demographics tab, there are 2 sections, Prorating and Questions. The prorating section at the top only needs to be completed once per year. We request this information to be completed when submitting the first quarterly report. If your prorating strategy changes during the year, please update this section. The Questions section consists of 9 demographic questions. We will go over both sections in detail. We also encourage all agencies to have written procedures outlining how VOCA reporting will be handled to ensure it is only reporting on VOCA-funded victims and services. What can be counted? Victims or services provided with VOCA funding and non-federal match funding if you have match. It is important to know that other federal funding cannot be used as match, and victims and services provided with that funding cannot be used as match. Agencies should be careful with tracking victims and services provided with non-federal funding to ensure they are not duplicating counts. For example, if your agency received FIPSA funding, which is a federal award, those funds cannot be used to match VOCA, and the victims and services provided with those funds would not be counted on the VOCA quarterly report. If the same agency was also receiving state funding like marriage license, then they would need to be careful to only count that portion that was being used to match VOCA funds, if they were using marriage license to match both their FIPSA and their VOCA grants. Agencies are required to maintain backup documentation for all questions in this workbook. This backup can be a copy of the intake forms or whatever is utilized to document these numbers. This documentation will be reviewed during monitorings. This can be very confusing. Agencies are encouraged to reach out to GMU staff to discuss your individual situation and how to make sure you're reporting correctly. We are here to help. Strategies for proration are listed in the order of desired use, and we're going to go through these rather quickly. For example, if your agency cannot use option 1, then they should look at option 2 if it is feasible prior to looking at option 3. Option 1, the most preferred method, is the agency can track separately because you have a system that can track by funding source, such as an electronic database service or system. What this means is that VOCA clients and services are completely different from clients and services from other funding sources, so it's easier to track. Option 2 is prorated based on staff salary. Option 3, proration on direct services budget. And option 4, the least preferred method, is prorated on victim service program budget. We started collecting data on what method of prorating each agency is using. At the top of the demographic tab, you will see these questions. First, you will mark which method of proration you used. See the yellow highlighted section. Simply put an X in the box below the method that you used. If you cannot track your VOCA victims and services separately, you will need to provide the information on your proration calculation with your report. See the boxes now highlighted green under this section. Lastly, remember to type in which system you use to track your data. This could be the name of the electronic system that you use, or Excel if you have a more manual tracking system. What method will your agency use to prorate your quarterly reporting? Take a glance at the chat box and please answer this question. A system that can track victims and service by funding source. B, option 2, prorated based on staff salary. C, option 1, prorated based on direct victim services. Or D, option 4, prorated on total victim service budget. Give you guys a few minutes to answer that question. Fantastic. It looks like most of you have a system that can track victims and services by funding source, so that's fantastic. I'm excited to see which system you guys all have when we see your first quarterly report. Are there any questions over the proration portion of your quarterly reporting? Okay, let's continue on our demographics tab. Question 1 is the total number of clients served, which includes new and continuing clients. It does not include anonymous clients. Question 2 is for anonymous clients only. Question 3 is for new clients only. These will be new clients that have not received services during the federal fiscal year. The federal fiscal year runs October 1 to September 30th, which is different from your VOCA funding award year. So it's important to pay attention to the quarter you're reporting in. Agencies are required to maintain backup documentation for all questions in this workbook. The backup documentation can be a copy of the intake form or whatever is utilized to document these numbers. This documentation will be reviewed during monitorings. This tends to be the most confusing part of the reporting. The biggest difference between state fiscal year, or SFY, and FFY, the federal fiscal year, are the reporting dates. We typically run all of our awards on the state fiscal year schedule, but that means reporting for quarter 2 looks a little different from the other 3 quarters, because quarter 2 is the start of the federal fiscal year, which runs October 1st through September 30th, whereas the state fiscal year runs July 1st through June 30th. All federally funded Q2 clients are considered new clients due to the start of the federal fiscal year. This pertains to the VOCA clients for Victims of Crime Act and the Family Violence Prevention Services Act, or FVPSA awards. We'll go over this a little more throughout this presentation. And as always, if you have questions, please contact one of us in Victim Services. Our contact information will be at the end of the presentation. Who is new? New individuals are those served for the first time during the federal fiscal year. Remember that the federal fiscal year is October 1, 2022 to September 30th, 2023. Ask yourself these questions. When was the last time this person received services from our agency? Was this person counted as new in a previous quarter of this report? The first quarter report that is due in October should be completed as if you are continuing services. So any client that is currently receiving services is continuing, and any new clients receiving services for the first time in July through September should be considered new. Quarter 2 is the start of the federal fiscal year, and this report can be a bit confusing as all clients are considered new for the fiscal year. If you are unsure if your agency is completing this report correctly, please contact our staff and we are more than happy to help walk you through this reporting form. All right, demographics tab continued. This is a summary of who you should be reporting for each of these sections. Questions 4, 5, and 6 should be new individuals only. Look for the green boxes. As long as they're green, they're good to go. Green is good, red means fix. Question 7 should be all victims new and continuing, and they can be counted in multiple victimization categories. Question 8 asks how many were counted as more than one type of victimization. Question 9 should be all individuals new and continuing. Now we'll go through each one in detail. Maybe. Okay. Race, ethnicity, gender identity, and age should all total question 3, your new clients. The total row is designed to indicate green for go and red for fix. If the total row is red, please fix the problem. If it's green, it's good to go. It will be red if it does not total the amount in question 3. To the side of these questions is a reminder that the total should match question 3. Now this year we added specify box to each quarter. Please remember if you report any numbers in a row that has specified boxes to the right to add the additional information. If they have a gender identity that is not listed in those and you click other, please specify what gender they're identifying as. Not reported versus not tracked. Not reported means that your agency has a method for collecting this data, but the victim declined to answer. Not tracked means that your agency does not track this data, either for all victims or certain victims. If your agency ran a hotline in a domestic violence shelter and does not collect age information on hotline calls, but does collect age information for victims staying in the shelter, that age category for all hotline-only victims would be not tracked. For the victimization section, put the total amount of victimizations presented during the quarter. The victims can, and sometimes do, present with multiple victimizations. Enter all of them here. The total of this section should be greater than or equal to the total of questions 1 and 2. If the total row is red, please fix the problem. If it's green, it's good to go. Remember, if you have a client report 3 types of victimization, you will count that in all 3 categories. For example, if you have one person who reports that they were a victim of domestic and/or family violence, robbery, and stalking harassment, you'll put 1 in each of those categories for that person. Also, remember, no category can be greater than the total number of victims you served. This means if you reported your agency served 100 victims that quarter, no victimization category can have a number higher than 100. Each person can only be counted once in each category. Are there any questions on that? This is one of our biggest problems in this workbook. Okay, then we're going to move on to one of the most missed questions of the quarterly reporting workbook. You need to remember to check if this number makes sense. If you reported that you saw 100 victims during the quarter in question 1 and 0 anonymous victims in question 2, but your total on the victimization section in question 7 was 110, that means no more than 10 victims could have reported more than one type of victimization, as you should be reporting all the types of victimization that each person reported. Question 9 is special classifications. This is pretty self-explanatory. Question 3, complete the direct services tab. Answer these questions for all individuals served, new, continuing, and anonymous. Remember, this should be only VOCA or prorated for VOCA. These questions are divided into 7 categories: victim compensation, information and referral, personal advocacy and accompaniment, emotional support or safety services, shelter and housing services, criminal civil justice system assistance, public presentations, and community education. You will see that this tab is divided into colors to assist you in completing the sections. There are helpful tips on the right side of each section to help. We will review these as we go through each section in detail. The direct service tab should be completed on the services all individuals served during the quarter received, new, continuing, and anonymous. This tab is where most of our data issues occur. This section is the only direct service category that does not ask for individuals served and services provided. It only asks for individuals. It's a victim compensation. This is a requirement for VOCA. You're going to count the number of victims assisted with a victim compensation application. VOCA compensation is different than VOCA funding that your agencies are providing to victims. It provides immediate financial assistance to qualified victims of violent crimes that occur in Nevada. The application can be located at the website on your screen. As a VOCA-funded agency, you must inform all victims you serve that might be eligible about the VOCA compensation program and assist those that are interested in completing an application. Not all victims will be eligible. For example, if the victimization was not a violent crime, or if the crime occurred out of Nevada, or if the crime occurred over 2 years ago. All eligible victims might not be interested in applying for the program. For example, some do not want to file a police report, which is a requirement of the program. Only count the victims that you assisted to complete the application on the quarterly report. Do not count those that you simply told about the program that did not qualify or did not want to apply for compensation. Remember, the number you report in this section can never be larger than the total number of victims that you served during the quarter, and you can see that reminder to the right. The next section is information and referral. This section will follow the format of all other sections on the Direct Services tab. You will see the first question on line 12 will ask for the number of individuals provided services in this category during the quarter. We have colored these questions slightly darker than the following ones asking about services. The first question on line 12 should count individuals only once, regardless of how many services they received. A1 through A4 should count the total number of services that were provided to the victim. An example of this would be if a victim received information about the criminal justice process from your agency once, and then referrals to other victim service programs 3 times. They would be counted as one individual on line 12, even though they received 2 types of services. One service would be counted on A1 as the agency provided one of those services, and 3 services would be counted on A3 because that service was provided 3 times. Remember, not to just add the services to get the total serviced, because that would give you the wrong number of 4 individuals served when only 1 person was served. Also, remember to count each time you provided the service, even if the same person received the same service multiple times. The number served in a category can never be greater than the total number of individuals served on the demographic line, tab 919. Since each individual must receive at least 1 service in the category to be counted on line 12, the sum of A1 through A4 must be equal to or greater than the number of individuals reported on line 12. This is because if everyone only received 1 service, then the sum of A1 to A4 would equal the number of individuals served, but if anyone received more than 1 service, the sum of A1 through A4 will be greater than the number of individuals reported. The next category of direct services is personal advocacy and accompaniment. You can see that it is structured the same way as the information and referral section, with line 18 asking for the number of people who received services, and B1 through B10 asking for the number of services provided. You'll see on the right it has the same rules as the previous section, that the number of individuals receiving services cannot be greater than the total number of victims on the demographics tab, and the sum of services must be equal to or greater than the number of people reported for the category. The next category is emotional support or safety services. You can see that it's structured the same way as the 2 previous sections, with line 30 asking for the number of people who received services, and C1 through C7 asking for the number of services. You'll see to the right it has the same reminders as the previous 2 sections. The next category is shelter or housing services. You can see that it is also structured the same way as the previous sections, with line 38 asking for the number of people who received services, and D1 through D3 asking for the number of services provided. You'll see on the right that it has the same rules of the previous sections. The next category is criminal civil justice system assistance. You can see that it is still structured the same way as the previous sections, with line 44 asking for the number of people who received services, and E1 through E11 asking for the number of services provided. You will see that to the right it has the same rules and guidelines as the previous sections. The last category on the Direct Services tab is Public Presentation, and it is structured a bit differently than the other categories. On line 57, it is asking for the total number of presentations provided during the reporting period. Then line 58 is asking for how many participants attended the presentations. Line 59 asks how many presentations were targeting adults, and line 60 how many were targeting youth. And line 61, how many were targeting a general audience. Each presentation should only be counted once on line 59, 60, or 61. For example, if you had a presentation that was for all ages, adults and youth, you would count it only on line 61. You would not count it on line 59 or line 60. The sum of line 59, 60, and 61 should be the number of presentations reported on line 57. Step 4, completing your scope of work tab. This tab will look different for each agency. The tab is based on what you put in your scope of work for your agency, and that was approved with your notice of subaward. If you need to make changes to your scope of work, you need to reach out to a grants and projects analyst, either myself or Christine, to make those changes. This is what a blank scope of work tab looks like. Your scope of work will have information put in the goal, objective, target number, and scope of work. It will also have your agency name and your grant number associated to that grant. This form displays what goal number and objective number the item was taken from in your NOSA and what the target number listed in your NOSA was. Are there any questions on quarterly reporting? Okay. Step 5, we're going to verify that our data is accurate. Look at your demographic tab. Are there any cells shaded red? Did you specify any answers that required a specification? Look at your direct service tab. Do you have service counts for all service categories that your agency offers? Check all notes on the side to make sure your numbers meet the requirements. Check that everyone on the demographics tab, line 19, was counted in at least one category on the direct service tab. Direct service tab, line 12, 18, 30, 39, and 44 must be greater than or equal to the demographic tab, line 19. Check for changes from previous quarters. Did any services increase significantly? And by significantly, we mean 10% increase or more. If they did, and the data is accurate, please note this and the reason why in your email when you submit your report. Did any services decrease significantly? And by a significant decrease, we mean 10% or more. If they did, and the data is accurate, please note this and the reason why in your email when you submit your report. Are there any sections missing or not completed? Did you complete your scope of work tab? That's typically the one that most people miss filling out. Please work closely with the victim services staff when compiling these reports. It's very important for us that we maintain accuracy and integrity when receiving and reporting the quarterly reporting data. If we can all report the same way, then we can show the federal agencies just how amazing our subrecipients are in helping those who are most vulnerable in our state. If you're unsure what type of proration works for your agency, please contact our office and we'll gladly assist you. Step 6, submitting your report. You're going to save the report with the name of your agency and the quarter in the title. For example, Agency VOCA Q1. Email the report to dcfsgrants@dcfs.nv.gov. Remember to explain any significant changes in the number from previous reports. You should receive an email confirmation of receipt within 3 business days. Due dates for the quarterly reports for this fiscal year are October 14th, January 16th, April 14th, and July 14th. SFY22 award extensions. If you have a state fiscal year 22 award extension, you will not need to submit a separate report. You're going to include all victims or services funded with both state fiscal year 22 and state fiscal year 23 VOCA funding for July 1st, 2022 through September 30th, 2022 on your state fiscal year 23 quarter 1 report. This will still be due October 14th, 2022. Just as a reminder, agencies are required to maintain backup documentation for all questions in this workbook. Backup documentation can be electronic systems your agency has in place to document the questions in the quarterly report form. It can also be intake forms, assessments, or whatever else your agency uses to show that everyone is unique and only being counted once. Always remember to reference the GERs. Your quarterly reports are in GER 2326, but are very general as they cover all GMU grants. Supplemental Q1 questions. You will receive a set of extra questions via email that you will need to be submitted with your October 15th report. Questions cover the federal fiscal year October 1, 2021 to September 30th, 2022. If you're new, answer them for July 1st, 2022 to September 30th, 2022. Just as a courtesy, we included the supplemental questions in this presentation and on your slides. We will send these out in the next couple of weeks so that you can answer them for your first quarterly report. These are questions written and collected by OVC, and the answers will not affect your funding in any way, but will help OVC and DCFS know what challenges our agencies are facing. Are there any questions regarding the RFR process or the quarterly report process? If so, please ask them now, and we're happy to answer any of your questions. Our contact information is on the screen. All RFR submissions are to be sent with the funds request email with the workbook and required backup based on your risk assessment. For a greater chance of receiving answers, email requests should be made to the GPA, either myself or Christine, and the DCFS grants email. That way, if someone is out sick or on vacation, we all have access to your email. At this time, we'd like to thank you for your time. We'll address the questions that came through in the chat box. If you still have questions, we'll stay on the line for another few minutes and you can ask them now. Otherwise, we'll give you the last 20 minutes left in your day, and thank you very much for your participation.